Some of the best television dramas and sitcoms center around public service. Why is that? Here in the U.S., we have shows like The Wire, Abbott Elementary, Parks and Recreation. British television gives us Happy Valley, The Vicar of Dibley, The British Empire, and Yes, Minister. That we can find both drama and comedy in the public sector may say something about the sometimes strange, difficult, often noble work of trying to do the right thing within impossible constraints. And that is really the heart of our book discussion today. Michael Lipsky's Street Level Bureaucracy, Dilemmas of the Individual in Public Services was originally published in 1980, updated in 2010, and today remains a classic. Lipsky's greatest contributions may have been his insight that public policy does not live only in a formal document. Rather, it is shaped every day by the decisions made by the frontline public servants. Dr. Michael Rowe, professor at University at Liverpool, anchors our discussion today. Joining us are Dr. Mandy Cantland, manager of East Bradford Township in Pennsylvania, and Matt Canlon, manager of South Boston in Virginia. I am your host, Nancy Hess, publisher here at Mooney Square. Mike starts us off with how Lipsky first caught his attention.
So many years ago, I was a civil servant in Social Security Administration, social administration, working in an extremely bureaucratic part of the civil service, almost assumed to be classically bureaucratic. Mm-hmm. And I was doing a master's program in public administration, and we were introduced to Max Weber on bureaucracy and other writers on bureaucracy, and then also to the kind of new right criticisms of bureaucracy about it being inefficient and so forth. And these were all intellectually very interesting, and they made some sense, and they helped me to think about my role. But it was only when I was introduced to Lipsky that it kind of actually described what I did in some way that I recognized. So I was working in middle management and relatively junior, really, position in the civil service. And so this described a world that I recognized much more clearly. And it wasn't so abstract in its thinking. It was much more about descriptive of things as I recognise them. So I found it really helpful, and it helped me to then think about my own interests as a civil servant. And subsequently in all of my teaching, really, it comes through when I'm teaching public servants, because it's stuff that they recognise very often. And it's only more recently that I've kind of traced back where this thinking comes from, and Lipsky sort of begins to trace this idea of street-level bureaucracy from about 1969. And he was active at that time in the civil rights organisations and movement. And I think he had a bit of a puzzle. He certainly comes out in his 30th edition of the book, where he talks about what his influences were. And one of those influences was this kind of struggle that the kind of tension between citizens and the public services. And Lipsky was trying to reconcile this with his knowledge of public servants and his kind of campaigning role in civil rights, but also in urban housing policy and areas. And he was arguing that the individuals are not solely to blame. It's not like they're all exercising prejudice or something, or being deliberately obstructive. They're working in a very particular context where the organizational setting, the performance targets, the managerial expectations, the rules, the limited resources, all put pressures on them and affect the way in which they make decisions and judgments. And so it's not just individuals being generous to one person and mean to somebody else. It's a lot of factors coming into play. So that's kind of what I find really interesting about him, because he's not a simple model. It's a complex way of interpreting the kind of the dilemmas, as he calls them, that individuals face.
Yeah. I'd like to find out if that resonates with Matt and Mandy. I said before we got on today that reading this book was like a tour over my 40 years in this business, and trying to apply the ideas that I the ideas that came across through my education, and then understanding that when I'm working with clients that it doesn't actually look like that. There's a lot more complications or nuances that happen in the organization which you have to accommodate. It's not just a matter of deciding what management wants to do and then having that realized in the organization. So Matt and And Mandy, does this resonate with you at all? Sort of this idea that there's dilemmas on the front line that are an exercise of discretion that maybe are not necessarily appreciated or fully realized at the top policymaking level.
Hi, Maddie.
You want me to start? Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And there are a couple levels I think that I can relate to. First of all, I think we've talked before about the tensions that exist in government between, when citizens want the government to be involved and when it's in their favor for whatever reason, they want the government to step in and be involved. And when it's not in their favor, of course, they don't and they want us to step back. And that tension exists obviously at a very broad level, but it really is the street level bureaucrat that feels that tension point most acutely because they're the ones that are in the midst of that delivery of when we are and are not going to get involved. And they're the ones that hear most immediately the disappointment or the gratitude one way or the other. So I think so many of the things that we talk about on a broad level in government, those street level bureaucrats are the ones that really feel most acutely. And the other level that I relate to it is that tension point and some of the things that Mike was talking about. I think it exists certainly when you're talking about just the organization itself. So, I'm in the local government level. So if I'm just talking about what our government body is doing, the rules and regulations that it's enforcing, the policies and the programs, all of those dynamics exist within our own government. It gets magnified when we add levels of government to it. And when, for instance, there's a policy or program that gets developed at the state or the federal level, I'm reflecting specifically on the US structure here, and gets dictated or filtered down all the way to the lower level, there's even a greater disconnect between the policy development side and the implementation side. And some of those frustrations and pressures and all of that are magnified even more the bigger that divide is.
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, government is inherently a blunt instrument. Law is not very surgical. So when you establish a law or a policy, it's just inherently challenging to apply that to unique human experiences. So I think that's the first inherent challenge with and I think Lipsky kind of addresses some of that it is just inherently difficult. So right off the bat, you're kind of dealing with a structural problem. And I think that's really maybe overall his big thesis is that this is not the bureaucrat problem, maybe as much as it's the structural problem. And I agree to a certain extent with that. I think there's also an issue with scale, meaning the bigger you get, the more this is all a problem. And I'm seeing that now being back in a very small town. It's very difficult to get bureaucratic when it's small and you know people. It's when it gets big and you don't know people that all this kind of stuff starts happening. You dehumanize people. It kind of just it's easy to kind of pull the bureaucratic position on things. But when it's small and you know people, you have to be real with people. You have to be kind of candid. You have to try and work with people. You have to try and solve problems. So I think it's inherent. And I think scale magnifies the problem.
Yeah. I want to link something, though, this idea of a smallness also to what Mandy said. I think there's the tension that Lipsky represents as the relationship between the citizen and the state, that there is this bureaucrat that's sort of the intervening. And in his writings, he talks early on about like the police have a beat or the social worker has a neighborhood or sector. So there is this added pressure that there's no one else really helping them. They're kind of in there and they have to make a decision on the spot. And sometimes then it gets involved in relationships and of the people that are on the ground. So whether it's small or even a city, I mentioned in our prep call that the show The Wire, that was one that just really I thought of a lot when I was reading this book, that you have, all this intertwining on the ground situational awareness, as the police say, that impacts how they make decisions, whether it's small. I'm not sure it's different in a small town versus a large city. I don't know what others think about that. Is there a difference there?
I believe there is.
So
I
for
believe
instance,
definitely is.
yeah, but so I think about I always love this example. I actually had this happen when I was working with Mandy for a while. The citizen who argued that the sinkhole in their property should be looked at by the township engineer because they pay taxes. So that engineer basically should have some involvement with their sinkhole on their property. And those kinds of relationships, citizens see, we see this in public works. I have this, you've got those big trucks. Can you move this out of my driveway? Or can you know, we hear these stories all the time. What would be different, Matt, in a large
Well,
jurisdiction?
I'll illustrate it with an extreme example. Imagine you've got your pothole example. Okay. You've got a pothole down on Elm Street and you're living in a small town. You know exactly who to call to get that pothole. Imagine you're on I-95. Who are you going to call to fix the pothole on I-95? I think that, and again, that's an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. The bigger you get, it just to the citizen. I mean, there's an old saying, and I don't even know where it came from, but it says, the larger the government, the smaller the citizen. And I think your ability as a citizen to function within a huge system is illustrated. Who would you call if there was a pothole on 95? The reality is we wouldn't do anything about it. But I wouldn't even know, and I'm in government. I wouldn't even know where to start on that. But I know in a small town exactly who to call. I would call the mayor. I would call the manager. I could call the public works director because I would know who those people are and say, look, there's a pothole. So I do think there's a big difference. And another thing, I think this, at least in the American system, I think it was always anticipated that the local governments were going to be the bigger impact on people's lives. And so there was almost no limitations on local government. That to the states. You guys figure out all the limitations were put on the federal government. And the reason was, I think our founders, and maybe not exactly for the reasons we're talking about now, they believe that the bigger the government, you get into all sorts of problems. They were concerned about tyranny and taking away the rights of people. But I think the principle is still true that the bigger you get, the government almost by definition is going to dehumanize people. It almost is just inevitable because the bureaucracy, as Lipsky is kind of saying, it almost has to happen because there's the only way you can deliver services at scale with limited resources.
Has that changed over time? I see signs along New Jersey Turnpike, call, 888, whatever the phone number is, if you see a pothole. Is it our perception, Mike? Maybe you could respond to this. Is it our perception or is it reality that there is this distance as the size gets larger in bureaucracies? Is that something we can just assume? An assumption.
I think distance is certainly something to do with it, and scale is, yes, absolutely something to do with it. I don't think being small inevitably means you can handle these things better. It makes it perhaps more manageable. I think the relationship between a street level bureaucrat and a citizen is probably very similar, regardless of how big the organization they work in is. But the ability of somebody like Matt or Mandy to manage that and to understand the variations and the discretion, etc., might be greater as managers of those street-level bureaucrats in a smaller community, smaller organization. Certainly scale is an issue. One of the things, knowing who to call, knowing who is responsible. Is it the town? Is it the county? Is it, I'm guessing about the state or the federal government? That's a major issue, certainly in the UK. Who is responsible for what is not always clear. Not least because quite a lot is now in the hands of private enterprise and so forth. So is the context in which Lipsky was kind of talking was a lot less complicated and complex than I think we see today. But I'm just thinking about as we have grown in recent years, there's a greater tendency to talk about students less as individuals and more as cohorts and numbers in the hundreds and even thousands, because you can't get to know them. So scale is definitely something. It doesn't have to be distance.
I would like to propose a different perspective, and that would be that there might be that the differentiator is actually at the top. That, and maybe you alluded to it, Mike, that it's more difficult to manage when the size gets large. I don't know, whether you could say or argue that the bureaucrats or the workers that are sort of at the front level are less likely to be caught up in they may not feel seen, or they may feel they have a larger degree of discretion. Nobody's really watching them too closely. But I think the greater peril is at the top. And Lipsky goes at great length to describe all the ways where there's a pressure from the state to say, we want to cut our budgets, we want to reduce our staff, we want to fill in the blank. And so we're going to craft out, we're going to make it appear as if we haven't changed anything at the bottom, but we're actually changing things. We're changing. And that's where the dilemmas come in. Now, you're working not just one job, but you're working a combination of jobs. And this happens at in the small municipality as well as the large city. And those workers now are trying to juggle, what does that mean in policy? We have these quality standards. We know what our mission is. How could I possibly do this additional work? Or maybe there's a restructuring at the top. They rename a program because there's some pressure that there should be a program that looks like I don't know, whether it's a cleanup program, eliminate all the potholes. Let's take that since we're talking about potholes. Let's just eliminate all the potholes. From the top, that may sound like that's a great, goal, but we haven't done anything at the street level in terms of added resources.
I think an example that comes to mind in Social Security in the UK, when the efforts were being made to cut the administrative costs of administering the benefits, pensions or unemployment insurance to people, they look to reduce the number of officers working in the organisation, to reduce the number of office buildings, etc. And that all makes perfect sense from on high. But then when you look at what the consequences are at a local level, it's much more problematic to handle locally. So if you close an office in a rural town, meaning that anybody who needs to access services now has to travel 30 miles on infrequent public transport, the consequences are significant for large numbers of people. So how do you manage that locally is an issue. How do street level bureaucrats then cope with trying to service the needs of people who are now struggling to even make contact with them?
Mm-hmm.
It's those sorts of things. What seems simple and clear at the top level in Whitehall or Washington has unforeseen consequences, and it affects the way in which individuals will then go about making decisions and use their discretion. And we can think about elaborate examples, but I always use a very simple example that when I was in Social Security, if I got 10 new cases arrive on my desk in the morning, and I could only had time in the day to deal with 7 of them, which one do I start with? Which 3 get left to the end and maybe get left to the following week? Or, do I prioritize? How do I personally prioritize those 10, those cases? If you then squeeze that time and that resource, so I can only manage 6 or 5, those decisions are just heightened. They're just made more intense, if you like. So what seems sensible at the top, at the bottom has unforeseen consequences, I think, is the key thing. And that's then how do you manage your street level bureaucrats who are struggling with these tensions? That's where the problem of management then comes in as well.
Right. And so before we go directly to the management problem, which certainly it is, we might first weigh in, is that discretion, given that context that you've just provided, is discretion inevitable? Is it desirable? Or is it a problem? Should we be concerned about the amount of discretion that has to happen at that ground level? As a manager, how does that weigh on you? Mandy, what do you think?
Yes, it's inevitable, it's a problem, and it's desirable. I think it's all of those things. I think listen, I think anytime you get, and Matt kind of suggested this, anytime you get a human doing anything, they're processing it through their own lens, their own bias, and you're probably going to get very few people doing something or processing something or implementing something in exactly the same way. There's always going to be a personal lens that is added to it, whether they agree with it, whether they don't agree with it, all of that. Because of the very, very basic and practical example that Mike provided, many times I think street level bureaucrats are working in a very unrealistic environment sometimes, and they're just satisficing, and they have to figure out a way to do it. And so it is a bit inevitable. In order to get a job done, you have to adapt and adjust in some way. And I kind of back to what I had said before, I think this problem becomes magnified when you're talking about levels of government and different governments, and this distance between policy development and implementation widens. In a small organization, when at the local level, I think we as managers have the ability to have this communication loop between the elected officials who are close by, who are developing the policies, and the people who are implementing them to really think through the implementation process better and to have a very close dialogue when you have a public, an elected official that thinks that they should be implementing this type of program. Okay, well, let's think about what the limitations are with implementing that on the practical side. And you get often, hopefully, better policy developed out of the gate, and everybody on the implementation side understands where it's coming from and they can convey that better to the citizens, and it's just a better product. The further you get disconnected, the less that communication loop exists, and I think that's where there becomes this disconnect between what's intended and what gets done.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to come back, Mandy, just to this idea that what you're describing to me is in some ways where he gets to in the last part of his book in managing. Now, I hear what you're describing there, that the more you can bring up that information from the front line and incorporate that into your conversations, the better product, I think is what you're saying, the better the service.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I try to very intentionally do that to involve the people who are on one side of a policy or a program in that whole development process, so that we're incorporating what they see as challenges into that policy development. And I think you end up with a much better product, and it's important to keep revisiting whatever that program is after it gets implemented and after you've started to actually put it into play, because there's inevitably going to be things that you didn't intend that aren't working the way you envisioned, other issues that you then have to tweak. And it's certainly not uncommon in my world to go through a lot of work to develop a policy, a regulation, think you've got it all ironed out, implement it, only then to turn back and amend it again because there are things that you didn't anticipate. But again, it's a small system, it's a closed loop. I'm relying on a talented group of people that understands what we're doing, that can communicate that to the citizens, and I think that's you end up with a higher quality product and better public service in that rather flexible environment.
Yeah. Matt, if you could talk about discretion, and maybe just to add one more layer to this, the idea Lipsky puts forward actually is that the policy, and you can confirm if you see it this way, it's actually the implementation that creates the policy. In this way, he sees bureaucrats at the street level are actually implementing or what's his language, Mike?
Yeah, they make policy, by the way. Yeah.
Do you see that implementation of policy as a part of policymaking?
Let me first say, I think in government, sometimes we have this really interesting phenomenon that occurs that the more complex the problem becomes, the more we think government should handle it. And ironically, it might be the exact opposite. Let me give you an example. So how good is government going to be in dealing with why someone is homeless and fixing their situation, why someone has substance abuse, why someone has domestic problems? I mean, those are so individual. And sometimes it may just require someone to love someone, to put their arm around this person. A bureaucracy can't do that. So in some ways, we're trying to attack problems at a bureaucratic and even federal level, national level, that really requires personal, one-on-one, human, loving, caring kind of relationships. So we try and tackle some of these things. And again, with a very blunt instrument of government, with people who have no idea who this client is, really doesn't care who that client is. I mean, if we're being very frank, they may care about him as they're a human being, but they don't love them. They don't have any feelings. They don't really have any investment in that person. And so now you're asking this person to use discretion based on what? And I think when there's an old saying that I firmly believe in. The first objective of a bureaucracy is to protect the bureaucracy. And I see that even in small organizations and big organizations, that's the first objective. So that bureaucrat is first watching out for themselves and the bureaucracy. But if you knew someone and you loved someone and you were trying to genuinely help that person, that's not necessarily the motivation. So I think we've got this incongruent situation to begin with, where you're trying to have this, and I don't mean this in a negative way, just heartless, meaning it's this organization, this kind of cold bureaucracy with people following policies and procedures, trying to solve a problem that requires intimate humanity. And I think that's just very difficult to bridge that. And so my heart goes out to people who are bureaucrats who are trying to address issues of homelessness, substance abuse, domestic abuse. I mean, think of all these very complex, what we would call wicked problems, trying to deal with those with a very blunt instrument.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'd like to just to go back, to what it doesn't matter, in my view, the size of the government. I think that this idea that there are those mission driven people get into service out of a sense of mission, out of a sense of wanting to help and contribute, and I think that informs their day to day world. It's the bureaucracy is something that you have to navigate, but it's not what is driving your decisions. For those who become callous or they're not able to perform well in those environments, and they typically will either leave or hang on and be a detriment to the organization because they're not able to bring that discretion that is a desirable level of compassion or consideration of circumstances that make the job challenging and also rewarding.
I think that's a hard part about what we do, though, as well. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, and I don't necessarily have an answer to it. But I think that it is hard to find the person. They're a bit of a unicorn that functions well in this environment.
Yeah.
And particularly at the local level where you really are boots on the ground of implementing and dealing with the citizens, it takes this bizarre combination of somebody who can be empathetic to a degree, or at least put themselves in the shoes of the citizens to understand where they're coming from, and calm, and just genuinely caring about the people that they're serving, but also in a very pragmatic and balanced way. And there also has to be this bit of disconnection with the emotion to be able to implement all of these things relatively evenly. And it's a hard personality, that I find. You find somebody that's either very rule driven and black and white and
Yes.
ready to throw down the hammer at every infraction, or the person that's just very emotional and just wants to help everybody, which also doesn't work. So that's a little bit of an aside, but that's been my experience at the local level, that finding the right people for this job is really one of my main goals, and then figuring out the best way to use them is kind of the second, because they're few and far between.
Yeah.
I don't think that is an aside. That's a side issue. I think that
Yeah.
sort of brings together some of the themes, because you want somebody who can engage with the citizen in a way that is empathetic, etc., and to try and make the system work to achieve what's good for the individual and the community and everybody else. But the organisation, the rules, the time you've got available, all of those may be stretched and compressed, so you're really struggling. So it's a person who commits to maybe additional time, additional effort to cases where it's important that you're looking for. They can't do it for everybody, though. That's the problem. That's where the difficulty is. And I think the worst kind of street level bureaucrat is the one who says the computer says no, so go away, kind of thing. You can find a way to be that sort of that uber bureaucrat, if you like. And there's a couple of authors, Stephen Maynard Moody and Macheno, who write about this idea of there's a state agent being the person who just says the rules say no, or the citizen agent, the person who takes up the cause of the citizen and advocates, tries to make the system work for them. I don't think they're two separate people. Very often they're the same person. It's just they're making choices about when to be one and when to be the other, because you can't be the citizen agent, you can't be advocating for all citizens all the time. You would burn out.
Yeah.
People do burn out.
Let's make this shift to the new public management ideas that came into being. So you have describing of the bureaucrat as you just have, Mike, that's citizen focused versus bureaucracy focused. And now you have another layer. You have these ideas coming out of the management schools. And we have here, I think, is where the quality standards really get introduced, and that if we write these quality standards, that's going to influence the performance at the street level. Talk a little bit about some of the ideas that the new public management. And I know Mandy has also done some thinking around this topic. It has some ideas. Yeah.
I mean, I think the key ideas were to introduce kind of ideas from the private sector into the old bureaucratic monolith, so that you would try to introduce some form of competition, whether in the form of sort of targets or genuine competition for contracts. Yes, standards, but also what can a citizen expect in terms of quality of service, promptness of service, that kind of thing. And so from my work with street level bureaucrats, that very often the focus was on targets and how those affected your work. So that if you think of that example I gave earlier, you've got 10 cases and you've got to choose which of the 7 you can do. This was before computers. That's gives some idea of my age. The paperwork, if it was a thick case file of a history of, that was a complicated case. So the easiest thing to do would be to put that to one side. The thin case, which is probably a young male unemployed applicant, probably very easy to do. So you prioritize the wrong things in order to meet the target to process 70% of your applications in so many days. So you had this kind of low-hanging fruit argument that you do the easy stuff in order to meet your targets and leave the complex stuff, which is actually probably where you should be devoting your time and energy to, if you have time for the end of the day. So that's the kind of thing for me, that it didn't change street level bureaucracy. It altered some of the pressures on those street level bureaucrats and changed some of the factors they were having to juggle and to balance in order to make ends meet, if you like.
Mm-hmm. What would you add to that, Mandy, from your studies around new public management?
Yeah, I think we're on the other side of the new public management era, and whether we're now into the new public service era, I think that was, one interpretation of what's next. But I think every era we go through, regardless of what you're looking at, the next era is the reaction to the one that was previous. So the focus of that new public management era was efficiency and process and performance and quantitative measures and really bringing the business world into the public world. And there are probably some advantages that we got out of that. I really think that some of the disadvantages or the impacts that we've experienced has been this, I think what they referred to as the hollowing of the state. We outsourced a lot in the name of efficiency. And sometimes that makes sense, but other times I think you start to really undermine the accountability of the public entity. And one of the things that I'd be curious to hear what Matt experiences, but I'm personally experiencing now where we had outsourced different services because it made sense, because that would be a service we wouldn't have to staff and develop ourselves. Now I'm seeing more and more quality and performance issues in the private sector. And I'm really thinking about the trash and recycling industry at the moment personally. And that industry is really having its own challenges to where the benefits that we got at one point from outsourcing some of those services are no longer really there. The costs are going up, the service is going down. Of course, the citizens still look to us, as well they should, for providing that service. And we have, less accountability, direct accountability than we would if it were our own staff. I'm really starting to see myself start to anticipate having to bring some of these things back in-house and to reverse some of the trends that we saw through that new public management era so that we can have more accountability, more control over the service delivery that we're providing to the citizens. So that's my own interpretation of that era of management thinking. And I think it's also just a reflection of the society we're in right now, which I think we're all still trying to figure out, of people don't want to work in the same way that they used to. They want more flexibility. They want to, nobody wants to do some of these jobs that need to be done. So it's an interesting time trying to match up the jobs that we have that need to be done at the public level and the citizenry, and the society that we're looking to get those jobs done.
Yeah. I'm also interested in Matt's experience over the years. You've worked at different places, Matt. Have you seen this idea of running government like a business, how that's played out in some of the different places you've worked?
So I think you're referring to total quality management. If you remember that back in the early 90s, there was and also reinventing government. And there was, I think it was Osborne was one of the authors, but that was a big thing back in the early to mid 90s. And in my opinion, it was a response to one of the very problems we're talking about, is kind of dehumanizing the citizen. So the idea is, well, let's not call them a citizen, let's call them a customer. And the concept is we've got to start treating them as a customer. It was really an effort to get us to start treating people better. And I think there was some value to it. You're right. Then we started privatizing. Now I've been in 4 communities, some of which privatized trash collection, for example, and some that did it in-house. And as a general rule, what I found is that you could do it more cheaply if you farmed it out. There were problems with quality sometimes. You were having to babysit a little bit. So there were issues with there. But doing it publicly always cost you more money. But you had a much greater consistency in quality. Those residents were seeing the same people every single day. So in some ways, I think the quality was better, and I think citizens tended to like it better when it was done in-house. But there was no doubt that we could save money. Now, we're doing it in-house now, and I think with what's happened with recycling and all that kind of stuff, we're kind of in a unique situation with the marketplace now. But when things were stable in the marketplace, especially with recycling, you could always do it more cheaply by farming it out. But I think it was kind of missing the point. We were still trying to get to that elusive, how do we do this more cheaply and how do we treat people better? And my personal opinion is I think government's going to be really good at doing repetitive tasks, fixing the pothole, doing very repetitive things that don't. But once you start getting into the humanity and human problems, it becomes very difficult. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't do it. It's just recognizing that they're not going to do it very well. It's going to be very difficult. I'll give you one example. So this is not a rip on Mike. Mike was he had 10 cases. Okay. Mike couldn't tell us the name of any of those people. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, I walked into our DMV here. Now, our DMV is very small here because we're in a small town. I go right up to the desk. The woman on the other side says, "Hey, Matt, how's it going?" Because I had interviewed her for a job. So right off the bat, we knew each other. The service level was much better. She even told me, here's really how you need to do it, Matt. She was giving, as Lipsky would talk about, giving the inside information. She was doing that just as a matter of course because we knew each other. My experience was very pleasant compared to my experience at the DMV in Philadelphia. I mean, I'd be lucky if they didn't yell at me across the counter. They wouldn't even look at me in the eye. But here I go in here and they're calling me by name and they're giving me all these suggestions and they're very pleasant. So again, I'm back to the scale issue and the humanity problem. Doing a driver's license is something I think government can be very good at. But if they're trying to fix my relationship with my spouse or whether I have substance abuse or whether I'm homeless, I just think it's a very, very challenging task for a government to do that.
I'd agree. I want to check though. I didn't know the 10. It was all by post. It was all very remote. Maybe you interviewed 1 in 10 people that applied at that stage. But what was really interesting was this is an office in the centre of Bristol. And it was in probably the most deprived part of Bristol at that point in time. And the security guards, who have absolutely no status in the hierarchy, in the bureaucracy, the building security management, knew the people who came into the building regularly. And they did know them personally, to the extent that they held a key for one of the regulars, the key to her flat, because she regularly lost the key. So, it was that level of kind of support to some people because they were known. So I think what's interesting is at the margins, the state is incredible. People in the state, in the state infrastructure, are capable of that level of attention to the individual. But it's not something it can do as a matter of course. It's not a policy you could implement that every office should hold keys for. It's just not something the state's built to do. Definitely not.
I think we move into to some of our final thoughts on this. I really want to talk about some of the reforms and what Lipsky does take away. He writes in managing street level bureaucrats, he does sort of a revisit. He looks back over his earliest works and he talks about what reforms really made a difference and what it's led to. And he has some value he sees in sort of the massive shifts. Like we might look at some of the top down from state and federal level as like these are bureaucracies that are really, or these policy initiatives are just too much to put on local systems. But he gives the insight that it actually was a way to change thinking, even if it wasn't the right exact way to do it. I think that's my takeaway, Mike, and you can maybe give us a slant on this. But there's also I think to Mandy's point that there was some takeaways through that new public management, and we do begin to think, okay, quality is important. Maybe we need to focus on. He talks about professionalism, and not that professionalism or the professional credentialing is always a positive. It's not a be all and end all, but it does begin to change mindsets in terms of what is expected at the worker level. So he's thinking now, if you're going to affect the worker street level bureaucrat, you do have to, maybe you could talk about even your pyramid concept. You have to kind of work from the bottom up. It's not necessary that you just take these big ideological concepts and force them down, but that you begin to think about how the worker experiences that policy implementation and think about the development of the worker. And finally, to the contracting out, you now have carved out government so that it requires government to work across silos. So they're working with nonprofits more. They're working in agencies that fall outside of government. So government has been forced to have relationships, not only with private business, but with nonprofits. It's a much different, it's not like an all-inclusive government anymore. It's a government that has to really work with many different sort of tentacles in the community. I wonder if you could, Mike, just, start with that pyramid concept. I think I relate that to where he kind of goes, how the worker views the system.
Yeah, I think, so a lot of my recent research has been with the police. And what's really interesting is when you're following an officer on the beat, in a patrol car or what have you, certainly in dealing with emergency response situations, and this is Matt's point, these officers aren't trained social workers. They're not really equipped to intervene in the complex emotional lives of families or so on and so forth. So they're trying to do the best they can to kind of manage a point of crisis. And it's actually really interesting how little the law or policies or rules impinge upon their thinking at that point in time. So actually, quite a lot of what they do is almost free from scrutiny, oversight, control. That's quite an extreme example of a profession, but that's the case for many others. That actually, that's why Lipsky talks about them making policy on the ground. That's where that's where policy becomes real for the citizen. Is when that person, that bureaucrat, interprets everything that's going on and makes decisions. So from that perspective, everything else is above. It's not, this is the real world. Everything else is kind of interference and burden. I think in terms of the changes over time, having to work across different organizations, I think the word bureaucracy is a bit of an unhelpful word in the kind of phrase street level bureaucracy, because it's not really talking about bureaucracy in the way we generally think about it. It's talking about those public servants at the front line. And I think they've always had to work across government departments, but they're now having to work with voluntary and community organizations, maybe with private businesses who are running outsourced services. But also increasingly, I think probably also in the US, you've been encouraged to engage much more with citizens through whether it be community groups or forums or other ways of hearing the voice of the community. So it adds complications, it adds challenges to the and pressures to the street level bureaucrat. But it's all, I think you're right, about balancing that effort to do better with probably with less as well. So that experience is all of these new ideas of how to do things better actually can feel like a burden, an additional burden, instead of actually a release to enable you to do things better. So and sorry to go on, but just to be so when it comes to reform, I think, and this is Mandy's point earlier, if you can involve those street level bureaucrats in thinking about making change, I think you have a better, and possibly, and also the citizens to the best of your ability, you have a better idea of how to make change to improve services than thinking from a long way away of just introducing new policies and laws and so forth. Sorry.
Yeah. And touching then on the credentialing and professionalism, Matt, for instance, when you think about your workforce, do you see more today credentialing or certifications than you did, say, when you started out? And has that been an influence on the way the overall organization performs?
Yeah, I think credentialing is always, and more education is always a good thing. I think it makes you more competent. It makes you more capable. You have more tools upon which to draw on. I don't think in and of itself it solves some of the challenges we're talking about, but I think it does definitely make you more competent. I happen to think, as I kept reading the book, I just kept thinking about one of the problems is the dehumanizing of we even call them the client. I mean, there's all these different words and in fact, the whole system essentially, and it's not, I don't think it means to dehumanize, but it's almost like you have to. It's like cattle. You know, when you're running cattle through a thing, you almost remember you don't name your cow. You don't if you're a farmer and you got a cow and you know you're going to butcher that cow, you don't name it. So I think it's almost like we have to do it because we have this blunt instrument and we're trying to run a bunch of people through it. So you almost by definition dehumanize the people. So confidence is very important. And I don't want to minimize that, but I don't think it solves your problem. I think you've got to have people. I think Mike was talking about it before. You've got to have people who are, whether they're inherently this way, or you teach them this about being compassionate and being empathetic and being fair and being just and all these great characteristics that just doesn't happen to human beings. You have to teach them that. And I think, you know, if I've got a police officer and he's with a bad guy or alleged bad guy, what ultimately is going to prevent him from either beating the snot out of that guy or treating him with dignity? And I'd much rather have a guy who is a fair-minded, just, compassionate person arresting this person than some guy who doesn't have some of those virtues. So, you know, there's an old story that says, imagine you're walking down a dark alley and you see four shadowy guys coming to you. You can't really make out anything, but you're a little bit, you know, your senses start going up. You're a little bit concerned. Would it made a difference to you if you had understood they were just coming from Bible class? Okay.
Mhm.
So whether it's Christianity or a Muslim or whatever, I think faith is one of those things. Family is one of those things. I think instituting some of those things that instills virtue and morality in people, I think doesn't solve the problem because I think you have these inherent structures, but it can help. It can help someone be a little more compassionate, a little more loving, a little more understanding, rather than kind of some of the cold things that Lipsky kind of refers to in the book.
So you really are taking more of an individualist tactic in the sense of each one of us is responsible for our personal orbit community, whether it's family, church, community, however we decide to participate. That is going to have the greatest impact on how we serve within government.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah. I think John Adams said it best. He says, talking about our form of government, he says, really is only self-government is really only suited for a virtuous people, meaning people who are trying to be good. Because if you don't, then there's really nothing that prevents people from being awful. You know, when no one's looking. So when no one's looking, are you going to be good or are you going to be awful? And I think, you know, teaching in your
Mhm.
home and in religion and ethics in school or all these kinds of things, ways you inculcate values. It's not perfect, but it's probably one of the more important, along with competence. You got to instill decency in people or else you get kind of unintended consequences, especially with a blunt instrument like government.
Mm, mm.
Absolutely agree on that. I think one of the things that Lipsky does talk a little bit about is that many street level bureaucrats don't even realize they're making choices. So they don't think about them as they're making those choices. And actually that's a problem because you've got to understand that when you make a decision of which seven cases I do out of the 10 of 8 on my day, I'm affecting people. I'm having consequences for people. And so I better do that deliberately rather than just randomly or what have you. And I think that goes for reform or change or some management as well. If you're changing the environment in which street level bureaucrats are working, is that a change that's going to improve things or have unintended consequences? So it's being much more deliberate, knowing that this thing called discretion is going to be there, and probably we want it there in many instances. How do we then use that
Yeah.
thoughtfully, responsibly? Yeah.
Takes us back to management. And Mandy, you know, you said the big challenge for you is to find those those people to bring into the organization. And it seems to me it really does require at the management level that awareness and that ability to cultivate. It's sort of like you're the mediator. I think I've certainly had the experience, and I would say most people do, where you're caught up in an environment where nobody is following any particular code. You know, it's a kind of a roughshod work environment. It's very difficult, even if you come from a background that says these, you know, virtuous sort of, you know, code of honor, and it's very difficult. So, Mandy, maybe you'd like to close out. Maybe we can do a closing round of where you find the role of managers in this complex environment.
Yeah, it's a very unclear environment. It's constantly changing. When I've had new people come on board, I've told them, well, the first year here is really just going to be just absorbing, and the system and just trying to get a sense of what everything is around you. And then you can start to try to make order of it. And the minute that you think you have it figured out, you're in trouble because you don't. If you don't have anything figured out, you're just going to constantly be learning and adapting, and not everybody is suited for that kind of environment. I think when Matt was talking about working with people to be kind and human and empathetic, and I do think I agree that I think that can be taught. I don't think it's easy to teach. I really think that you're better off when those are inherent qualities in somebody. I think there's things that you can do to develop that, but it's much easier to teach somebody how to build an Excel sheet than it is to teach them those types of characteristics, which is why I say really paying attention to the people you have does make a huge difference. And all of this comes down to time, too. It takes much more time to be human and to take some care in the people that you're serving than it does to just check boxes and click, whether they get this service or that service, and which then circles us all the way back to efficiency. So I think this is always the tension of whether the extent, I should say, that we're focusing on being efficient and bureaucratic and process driven versus the extent to which we're really thinking about the humans that we're dealing with on the other end. And I think that's that tension point that we at the delivery level are constantly balancing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can appreciate that. And Matt, how do you see that role of the manager in the system, and how is that role sort of mitigating some of the influence on that street level bureaucrat?
I think from a management perspective, you have to have kind of a realistic understanding of what you think your organization can do and can't do. So I think there are some
Mm.
things that bureaucracies are trying to do that we're just going to continue to have these kinds of problems because it's baked in. So sometimes you just have to acknowledge, we can't really do this. Maybe we've got money, so maybe we farm this out to some nonprofit. Maybe we do whatever. But trying to approach some of these things from a bureaucratic perspective with civil servants is probably not going to work. We've got like 50 years of experience with this. So I think that's part of it. But I think, Mandy's exactly right. You're not going to suddenly start teaching employees how to be good people when you hire them. They sure as heck, I hope, would have gotten that from their families, from their schools, from their churches, from wherever they would have gotten it. So by the time they get to be adults, it's already there. So, if you've got an employee coming who's just kind of a bad person, that's going to be a management problem forever. I mean, it's going to show itself in a lot of different ways. And so I'm not so sure there's a solution to that. But I really think we need to have hard discussions and be honest with ourselves about what we think bureaucracies, which are a necessity. I'm not saying you get rid of this stuff, but understanding what it can do well and what it can't do well, and quit kind of pretending.
Yeah. Mike, where does this leave you with your ideas about bureaucracies? How does it come out for you? Do you see hope in the bureaucratic structures that we're living with today?
I'll take an easy way out. I'm an academic. I'm not here to see hope or anything. I'm just here to observe and to make helpful comments, probably.
What are your observations about the future?
So I think one of the things we've not touched upon is one of the solutions that has been much in vogue for the last 30 plus years, which is to computerize everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, if we talked earlier about, if you want to kind of empathetic public services, computerization is not the answer. And I think that's one of the problems is this hope, most recently in AI, that this will somehow make discretionary decisions on behalf of us is frightening to me. If we're talking about making conscious decisions, ethical decisions, moral, however we want to think about them, the idea that you give it over to a computer programmer to program into a machine to come up with the answer is foolhardy in the extreme. So I don't think it's more computerization we need. Yes, computerization has value in supporting decision making. And we must focus upon the skills, the abilities, and the context in which those people we expect to do these difficult jobs are working.
Mm-hmm.
We need to just think much more about those individuals
Yeah.
and what we're asking them to do.
It's a slippery slope, too. It might be that this generation knows that when the AI is an assist on some sort of discretionary decision, we use our own discretion. But I think about the next generations that become sort of immune to that disrupting human element, that they're just become too comfortable. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Computer
we're
says
gonna-
no is going to become the answer.
Yeah. Lipsky hints at automation, but does not address AI. So that could perhaps be another conversation. Does the automation and the technology help us in bureaucracies or hurt us? I think that's probably the larger question. And I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in on that before we sign off.
I think it's helpful. I think a lot of this stuff is very helpful. And I'm glad Mike brought this up because this is like a huge thing going forward. I remember like 10 years ago sitting in my first conference when we were talking about AI and they were talking about and I raised my hand and I said, what could possibly go wrong with this? And it's like, if this is like out of a 1950s dystopian novel, I mean, there's a ton of things. I mean, you're further dehumanizing. And so I think AI and all the computer technology is a wonderful thing and could be a great support. But gosh, if we ever get to the point where we're letting the computers and AI make the decisions, I think you're going to get some very, very dark things.
Mm-hmm.
I think. Sorry, Mandy.
I was just gonna, my perspective is on technology in general, and AI is really no different, is it's not good or bad. It just makes whatever we're doing faster and more accentuated. So any flaws that already exists in our programs and our practices, I think just get accentuated and faster. So I don't think it's it in of itself is a solution. I think it can be a tool. I think it can certainly aid in a variety of different ways, but it's not in and of itself, in my opinion anyway, the fix. And it certainly, I don't think, is going to enhance any of the humanity issues that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike,
I'll just add
close us out.
one thing, which is that I think IT helps us to do our jobs. I mean, it's helping us have these conversations.
Yeah.
For a start, we wouldn't conceive of this 30 years ago, probably even 10 years ago. But it takes me back to my civil service days. And this is a national computer system for benefit maintenance. To change that system was a horrendous task. Once you want to make a tweak to a rule or a regulation, the programming consequences, the cost, the time delays, everything, it can speed up the day-to-day, but it can have unforeseen consequences in terms of reorganizing, repurposing your organization. So, Mandy, you talked about being in a small organization, being able to adjust a policy, not when you've got computers involved on that kind of scale. It just becomes a whole other headache. So, yeah, they scare me, but then I'm a Luddite.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I mean, the news just gets darker. I don't know when we're going to begin to lift out of this, but right now the outlook for AI feels kind of dark, even while we all agree we're using it and finding benefit from it. It's a strange period that I don't know how long it'll take till we get some clarity, but it is certainly interesting in light of bureaucracy. And this book is really an interesting look back on where we've been, Lipsky. And I think it does ask us to re-examine our bureaucratic structures and to examine what is a value and where Matt, really focuses on the human side. That could be the whole central question. That is probably the most important question going forward. It's certainly, it's an imperative for us right now to think about our systems and how we can make it attend to the human needs as opposed to the efficiency needs, as opposed to the cost needs, all of that important, but not as central here. This wasn't an easy read, Mike. It's going to be a while before I ask you for another book. No, I'm just kidding. We have Mandy's book next, a Gooseman book. So maybe we'll take a breath. But I Valuable. My gosh, this was really a valuable read. So I thank you so much. And I look forward to writing a little bit about it. I hope if you all are inspired, you'll do the same and share it on Muni Square. We'll have maybe a collection of reactions to Lipsky's work,
What
if
is
you'd
what is
like.
Mandy's book? Is that the
What was
next
that?
one that's being
Monica Gutzman. What is it called, Mandy?
I never thought of it that way.
I never. Yeah.
So
is it
definitely
is
an
it
easy read in comparison.
is it nonfiction or is it
No, it's nonfiction.
okay?
Yeah.
I
It's
never thought of it that way.
I never thought of it that way.
Okay.
Somewhere. Oh, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a big book.
Okay.
But
Well, I'll
thank
sign
you
off.
all for being
Cheers.
here. It was so great to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you,
Okay.
See ya.
Nancy.
Good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.